Patrons, how are you? Good to see you again. I thought I would have a bit of an opportunity to sit down and have a chat with you about a significant event in the world of, shall we say, chapdom, which has been all over the news, certainly in the UK for the last few days, and that is the news that James Bond is more than likely to be beginning a new life journey. And the reason for this is because there has been a shift in the control, or the creative control, of the James Bond franchise, and it's now in the hands of basically Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Now, for those of you who are not in the know, James Bond, of course, was written by Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was a bit of a cad, a gentleman who enjoyed his women, his alcohol. I think he spent most of his money during his lifetime, and basically he died at the very young age of, I think, 56 in the early 1960s. I forget exactly. I actually visited his grave last year when I was passing it in England. Anyway, so he sold off the rights to his movies in the 1950s, as I recall. So basically, the filming rights for his books have been, and the name James Bond, have been owned by the Broccoli family. So Barbara Broccoli and her stepbrother, a chap called Michael Wilson, have been the producers of the Bond movies that we see since that point. Right? It's shifted down the family line. Cubby Broccoli was the first sort of kingpin of that family. He was in a partnership with another guy, but he bought them out, and basically they've controlled Bond. They've been, in essence, the gatekeepers of the James Bond legacy over all these years. However, right, they've now sold up. Right, the rights to the movies were bought up a while ago by Amazon Prime, MGM, whatever it was. I think Amazon bought MGM, so they gained control over the Bond releasings, the recorded work. And just recently, and I read it in the paper this morning, right? It cost £1 billion or dollars, I forget which, for Amazon to gain creative control. So Barbara Broccoli and her stepbrother, $1 billion. Now Amazon has full control over, I say full control, it said they're co-owners, but it's been very clearly reported that Amazon now has creative control. And for £1 billion, you'd expect to have no holes barred. So that's exactly what they've got. And people are speculating, this is horrendous for James Bond. What's going to happen? That's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to give you my thoughts on what the future of our favourite spy and sartorial mentor to many of us growing up, what lies in store for Bond. Is it positive? Is it negative? Well, the first thing I'd want to say, I don't think it was entirely healthy where the producers, the Broccoli sort of empire, where they were going with Bond anyway. All right, let's put it on the table. Yes, they were the gatekeepers and they did certain things with Bond which have kept it somewhat pure up to this point. But, you know, they've not produced, the gaps between the movies were incredibly spaced out. We're 5 years since the last movie was made. No signs of another movie through their impetus. They haven't even got an actor cast, a director, nothing at all. Right, so basically, the people in charge of the Bond journey were doing nothing with James Bond. And the gaps between the movies was becoming further and further apart. For me, it was clear that those folks had lost interest. And I can't blame them, all right? Barbara Broccoli, I believe, is 64. Michael Wilson was 85, something like that. You know, one would presume they've got enough money for a lifetime. They've had Bond in their lives since they were kids. I can't blame them for having had a guts full of it. And if somebody offered you, I don't know, 500 million a piece to walk away and let somebody else take the thing forward, who would argue with that? I can't blame them. But just remember, they weren't doing a great deal with Bond anyway at this point. So, you know, what have they given over to Amazon? Something to get on with, I would suggest. I wasn't overly impressed with the last few Bond films, if I'm being honest. It might be a somewhat unpopular opinion, but I always found Daniel Craig's portrayal of James Bond somewhat morose, somewhat miserable. And, you know, I know he was portraying a Bond who was damaged goods. You know, he'd lost the love of his life in the first movie. He was an alcoholic, you know, kind of implied throughout all of the movies. Sad, dreary, not much fun. Not like the earlier Bonds, you know, the Roger Moore, the Pierce Brosnan. They were played, I'm not saying light-hearted, but you know, they just had a more cheerful outlook. Whereas I found the Dan Craig more realistic portrayal, and let's be honest, it's not realistic at all. You know, I'm sure MI6 agents and caseworkers do not act like James Bond. They don't drive Aston Martins and have drink problems. But his seemingly more realistic portrayal, I just found so drab and dreary. And as I say, morose is the word which keeps coming to my mind. You know, no happiness or joy in the portrayal at all. So for me, I am hopeful that Prime, MGM, Jeff Bezos, whoever's going to, you know, Jeff Bezos himself has been tweeting, apparently saying it's a new era for Bond. You know they can't faff this up. Bond is a character which has to be handled with kid gloves. And I think they will. I mean, in recent years, there's been far too much commercialization of James Bond anyway. We've seen, you know, Ford, for instance, every Bond movie in the last few years, a car which was owned by, you look at Casino Royale, and any scene where there is mechanized transport, it is a Ford. It's either an Aston Martin, which were owned by Ford at the time, Jaguar, you know, a Ford vehicle. It was overwhelming product placement. Even the things that Bond wears himself. Tom Ford, everything provided by Tom Ford in his style of fashion, which isn't very British. I was in Turnbull and Asser earlier this week as I filmed this, and I was chatting to the guy. I was having some bespoke shirts made. Some of you will be familiar with that, a birthday gift to myself. And I said to the guy who's looking after me, you know, of course your history with James Bond makes Turnbull and Asser something which is synonymous with being a gentleman. And he said, yes, it's sad, isn't it? But, you know, from the only of the recent movies which we made shirts for was Casino Royale. And, you know, at that point, the Bond producers, Eon Productions, they would come to us. We would make the shirts for him. They would buy those shirts as everybody else. It was, you know, a transactional situation. They would buy the shirts for Daniel Craig. He's a customer, same as anyone else. Then it became, you know, we want the shirts for free. And then it became, you pay us for us to have the shirts in the movie. That's where Tom Ford came in, wrote them a big check, got his stuff in the movies, managed to shoehorn his brand into the Bond situation. For me, that's really unattractive. You know, it is not going to endear me to buying Tom Ford stuff. Absolutely not, the opposite. And that's what the current producers were doing. So, in order to flesh out what my thoughts are on what may happen with this Bond situation, I've made some positives and some negatives. I've gone to the extent of writing them down. So, potential positives. This is what I've got. Bigger budgets. Yes. MGM Prime, whatever they call themselves, they're clearly going to be a very, very well-funded situation. The Bond is going to become, you know, their flagship product, without a doubt, one would imagine. So they've got deep pockets. We are likely to see, I mean, the Bond films before always seem to be quite well produced, with budgets being no issue, to be honest. But they may be less inclined to take product placement because they've got the financial ability not to do that. So hopefully we might see Bond going back to wearing a Rolex instead of wearing the product placed Omegas, which we've seen in the past. Things like that, you know, hopefully that could be a positive. Another positive, undoubtedly more frequent releases are likely to come because they're not going to have invested the billions of pounds in the Bond journey without expecting an equal amount in return. And that's not going to come from one movie every 5 years. Now, I don't know if it'll go back to one movie every 2 years like they used to be in the early days. Who knows? Of course it's possible. Of course it's possible. It depends on what they're going to do. But absolutely, we're going to see more frequent releases and maybe more expanded content as well. You know, there's going to be a Bond universe now, for sure. Are there going to be spin-offs? Other characters? Who knows? Is that going to devalue the Bond brand or add weight to it? But certainly we're going to see a lot more Bond content in the year ahead. How they manage that is what we're all interested in. But it's definitely going to happen, isn't it? And what we will see, I think, as a positive, is a creative freshness and maybe some innovation in the series. Because up to this point, that was not there. I mean, the last few years, I found the last couple of Bond movies, of course I enjoy watching them. You know, Spectre, No Time to Die, they were weak, I think, in the Bond journey. If you look at where they stack up against other Bond movies, they were not strong. They were not strong stories. They relied heavily on this Spectre organization, which, you know, dates back to the original Bond movies. Some fantastical plots and storylines about, you know, bionic eyeballs and all this sort of thing. They were hard watches, particularly with the feminism shown in them. These, you know, female female spy operatives who were easily able to overpower men, you know, physically robust, tough military men. And, you know, what I'm trying to say is it took us beyond the realms of belief to tick the box of feminism. I hope we can put that to bed now with some new creative freshness, some new protagonists, antagonists. There's a lot more to do. We haven't got to just stick to the same old Blofelds. Let's go in a different direction. And I think that's likely. That is likely. Where there are positives, there are almost certainly going to be negatives. Negatives for me, the relaxation of Bond's uniqueness is very, very likely. Now, at the moment, the fact that we only see Bond once every 4 or 5 years keeps it a very special event. Here in the UK, you know, the release of a Bond movie makes the national news because he is something of a proud national product. You know, he harkens back to an era where Britain had a much different place in the world pecking order to it does today. You know, the UK is a mid-tier country. When Bond started his journey, the UK was still an empire, a serious player in the world. And when we see Bond movies coming out, it gives us that feeling of nostalgia that the UK is still a country of consequence, whereas truthfully, it's probably not anymore. So that, you know, that's going to change. We're going to see a relaxation of that specialness, because if we're seeing movies coming out every so often, my worry, of course, is that Prime, MGM, they're going to turn this into a cash cow for themselves. That is the risk, isn't it? That there'll be an overexposure. And that's the next negative I've written here. Oversaturation. Yes, we're going to have a Bond movie. That's obviously going to be their main product. But then are we going to have spin-offs? As they've done, as other companies that have control over the movies, as they've done with things like Star Wars. Various other things, Doctor Who, any big product which is famous for one thing, you know, Marvel, look at Marvel, you know, they ruled the world, didn't they, when they started making movies, Iron Man and so on. But the last few years, they are making utter shit. I mean, you couldn't pay me to watch a Marvel movie at the moment, and I used to enjoy them. I used to enjoy them as everybody else, a bit of, you know, you could park reality and enjoy those movies. Now, you'd have to hold me at gunpoint to watch one of their films. And even then, I'd have to contemplate whether, you know, risking my life and escaping would be worse than actually watching the movie. And I would hate to see Bond fall into a Marvel-esque black hole of constantly churned out crap. You know, like the Young Bond series, or maybe a story, the origin story of Q, or something like that, you know? And that would kill it, because its specialness, I think, is borne out by its infrequency of seeing it. It's a rare beast that keeps us interested. And yeah, I mean, the other worry I have is that the creative control going from a legacy organization like the, you know, Eon Productions, basically two people, Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, who it is said got to do everything. They were somewhat micromanagers. They chose the actors. They very much controlled the strings of those movies. Now it's corporate control. And are we going to see an entirely different approach to the character because of that corporacy? We're definitely going to see increased branding, brand partnerships. You know, who knows where that will go. We can only cross our fingers and hope that they realize that they've got something unique and special, and they take heed of the lessons learned by franchises like Star Wars, for instance, and Marvel, which have been ruined by overexposure and oversaturation of the product. So finally, just to round off, give you my views before we become somewhat verbose and just start talking about it. I think Bond needed a reinvention. He was going to have a reinvention anyway. He died in the last movie. So it is a perfect point to draw a line and start again. He's going to be starting from scratch, whereas I felt he was starting to look stale, and the product of the old Bond, the Dan Craig, was looking a bit damaged anyway to me, right? He was stale, he was boring, he was dull. Now, new line, fresh Bond. Craig, to be honest, played him in a way which I didn't like. I can hope that, I mean, there's already whisperings, aren't there? Now that it's going to be a new company looking at this, I hear lots of talk about Henry Cavill, who is universally the global favourite to play the role of James Bond. And now that there's somebody else at the control, the creative control, who want these films to be successful, it is more likely, I think, that could come to pass. Because Henry Cavill, what's he, 41, something like that? You know, if they're going to make films faster, he could still get 5 movies in before he aged out. Don't forget that Roger Moore went on till he was 58 in the role, and he looked 58. Whereas Henry Cavill, you know, he's an elite athlete. You look at the guy's body, the way he looks after himself. He's not going to look 58 when he's 58, you know what I mean? He's probably going to look 50, 45. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that we will get the one that we all hope, Henry Cavill, into that suit. And hopefully that suit will be made on Savile Row, and it will be, you know, very much a British product. And yeah, hopefully new material, new protagonists, new antagonists, more akin to Fleming's legacy. More akin to Fleming's legacy. And there we go. So, and I think it's important that this is a success, because quite many of us in the, if I call myself a style YouTuber, I really don't like to think of myself in that vein. I'm not a stylish man. I'm just a bloke who's interested in self-development, and sometimes that includes talking about the way I present myself and others in clothing. But for many of us, Bond has been a sartorial role model. He's been a mentor, because in many situations where men, particularly in the more recent years, have grown up and their fathers did not dress to go to work. They maybe not have had fathers around. So the role model they looked up to, how to dress up to go to a wedding, how to go to a job interview, how to look smart, to present themselves well, it was often James Bond. He was often the role model for the way that many young men dressed. And hopefully, you know, now the new creative controllers will realise that is a legacy worth holding on to, and we will see Bond return to his original roots and get his suits from Dedge and Skinner, his shirts from Turnbull and Asser, maybe his shoes used to be Crockett and Jones. Why not see him go to somewhere like Gaziano and Girling? You know, cutting edge of Britishness, but at the same time, style as well. Let me know what you think. Am I being too optimistic and hoping that the future is rosy for Bond? Or are we going to see a descendance into the Star Wars multiverse of crap like we've seen with other legacy franchises? Let me know what you think. I'll speak to you again very soon.